Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. My name is Andrea Richter Sanchez and I'm a second-year master's student at the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs at the University of Washington. I'm part of the program on climate change and we have a subcommittee of graduate students called the Public Engagement Committee. So we like to put on this event called the Schooner series once or twice a year to help with graduate students to give talks to the general public about climate change. We give a different theme each time. As you guys saw in the announcement, our theme this year is UW grad students in hot pursuits for climate solutions. And also we partner with CCA, which is Cascadia Climate Action. We have tablers here, some local nonprofits and organizations. I'm gonna let them introduce themselves. I'm gonna pass it to Mary.
I'm Mary Manis, Cascadia Climate Action since 2015. My mission is to help people that are just regular people that are a little concerned about climate change find something they can do. So we maintain a calendar of upcoming events. We put on events like this. We put on the Climate Science on Tap series. They became very popular. We loved collaborating with the UW's program on climate change and getting the latest research results from the students there. And we also like to be able to share with you, the people that are really out on the front lines trying to do things about climate policy. It's the people on the grassroots that will have to really get people behind the policy changes that are needed.
And we're going to have some speakers from the other organizations just talk a little bit, introduce themselves.
I'm Robin Briggs. I'm with People for Climate Action. We're a group that has chapters in different of the King County cities, and we're the Seattle chapter. And we work on getting the city, mainly, which has these great climate goals, but we work on getting them to actually do the policies that will get us to where we can actually meet our climate goals. So we advocate with them a lot. We comment at council meetings and we send letters and try to get them to actually do the stuff they've already committed to do.
Hi, my name's Tim Gould. I'm here this evening on behalf of Climate Rail Alliance. Climate Rail Alliance is an organization that advocates for improved rail as a climate solution. And one of the things that we're urging is funding from the legislature to get our Amtrak Cascade services improved in a short time frame, in a time frame that matters for the climate.
Hi, I'm Cindy Irvin. I'm representing Green Buildings Now. We are helping with funding actually also to help with a just transition to clean energy. At the moment, we are working on a partnership to help create a fossil fuel-free resilience hub on South Beacon Hill.
Thank you so much. We're going to start with today's speakers. So our first speaker is Christine Nolan in the biology department. Christine is a third-year PhD student studying plant molecular biology at UW. Her main research interests are how plants sense their environment through genetic and molecular mechanisms. In her free time, she loves to ski, rock climb, and hike, and she's currently learning how to identify native plant species in Washington.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for coming, and thanks so much to the organizers of this event, to all the climate activism groups that are here, and to the PCC. I'm so excited to be a part of this. Today, I'm here to talk to you about this topic that has become really near and dear to my heart over the last few years, seagrass biology and restoration. And so the UN calls seagrasses our ocean's secret weapon in the fight against climate change, which is the reason for my talk title. And I hope to convince you today that seagrasses are this really important tool going forward that we can use to help mitigate the effects of climate change. Next slide. So before I get into seagrasses and all the nitty-gritty details of restoration, I invite us all to take a minute to think about how climate change affects whole ecosystems, not just the individuals inside those ecosystems. So for thinking about the wildfires that we all experienced this summer, it's not just the trees and the plants that are affected when those wildfires take place, but all of the organisms that live in that ecosystem are affected when these wildfires happen. Same with these dryland ecosystems, which are often used for agriculture. When severe drought takes place, which has been happening over the past few years, it's not just the plants that are experiencing those negative effects, but all of the organisms within that ecosystem, the birds, the animals, the insects, everything, they all suffer at the hands of climate change. So another ecosystem that we can consider when we're thinking about climate change are these coastal ecosystems, like the ones we see in the Puget Sound or all across the coast of the Pacific Northwest. And coastal ecosystems are really important for a myriad of reasons, but just to name a few, they protect our shorelines against erosion. So when a storm comes in, it prevents essentially the shoreline from being washed away. And another reason why coastal ecosystems are super important is because a lot of jobs and industry, especially here in Washington, are really dependent on the functioning and health of these ecosystems. So it's important that we take care of them. And a key component of coastal ecosystems are seagrass, which you can see in every one of those photos. And seagrasses, as shown here on the left, next slide, or next dot, are a foundation species of coastal ecosystems. So what that means, this foundation species, is without seagrasses, these coastal ecosystems could not exist at all in the way that we imagine them, in the ways that we picture them today. And this is in part because of the key ecosystem services that they provide. And so I won't name all of them, but to name a few, they provide habitat for coastal organisms like fish, crabs, all sorts of wildlife, like this sculpin here we see swimming in an eelgrass meadow. That video was taken in southern Washington, so right here, or in this state. And then among the other things they do for our ecosystems is they provide this huge resource of capturing carbon from the atmosphere. So seagrasses, of all of the ocean's ability to pull carbon out of the atmosphere, seagrasses are responsible for 18% of that work, despite only occupying 0.1% of the ocean floor, which is kind of crazy. And not unlike other foundation species that exist in our planet, seagrasses are heavily affected by human-driven pressures, such as human-driven climate change, like ocean acidification, pollution, rising global temperatures, etc. And also because of an increased frequency in human-driven disturbance events, such as when we dredge a bay out to help a boat pass more easily, or build a building in a bay or an estuary, or build a marina. All of these events tend to negatively impact seagrasses. And because of this, seagrasses are experiencing an annual global loss rate at about 7%, and that number is rising. And so to put this into context, this is the equivalent of losing a football field's worth of seagrass meadows every 30 minutes, which is kind of a staggering thing to think about. And this is not a problem that is just localized here in the Pacific Northwest. Seagrasses grow across the globe, so everywhere on this map that you see is green, colors didn't fully come through, but everything that's green essentially is where seagrass grows, and you can see that it's all over the place. And so there's really this pressing need to think about how are we going to protect and conserve our seagrasses going forward. And so in response to this, sorry if I keep coming in and out. In response to this, Washington, so here in our state, we have passed this bill called the Kelp Forest and Eelgrass Meadow Health and Conservation Initiative. This bill was just passed in 2022. And as part of this bill, eelgrass, which is our state's native species of sealgrass, is put at the focal point. And if I could get the next slide, a key component of this bill is to conserve at least 10,000 acres of kelp forest and eelgrass meadows going forward, and to do this all by 2040. So this is a really, really ambitious goal that has been set forth by the state, but it's really important that we rise to the challenge and kind of figure out how to do this. And so, to accomplish this goal in the next 20 years, we need to have all of the tools and all of the technology and all the restoration power at our hands in order to really get at this super ambitious goal. And so one tool that we can use is seeds. So unlike most seaweeds that you think about, like kelp or other seaweeds that you might be coming to mind, seagrasses, including eelgrass, are actually flowering plants, like the flowers in your garden. And so when they flower, they actually look a lot like this. And you might be thinking, well, I don't see any flowers on that green stalk, Christine. But the flowers are quite small and are found in these little clumps all over that long green stalk. And so, like in your garden, when those flowers are pollinated, we get seeds. And seeds are really important for a population's ability to respond to stress for two main reasons. One, just like you are genetically distinct from your parents and all your family, each of those seeds is a genetically unique individual. And by having an increased amount of this, what we call genetic diversity, it increases a population's ability to respond to stress and to survive in the long term. Also, in the short term, you can imagine when you have a disturbance event, so like let's say we dredge out a bay to make it more easily passable for a ship, and we remove all those eelgrass plants in the process, the only way that that population is going to be able to come back the following year is through the seeds it leaves behind. And that's exactly what we see on that photo on the right, a site that has been dredged out for some human purpose, and the seedlings are coming back the next season. So super important. Seeds are great for us. Let's think about how do eelgrass produce seeds? So this doesn't happen every year, and scientists don't really understand what causes a plant to just grow to produce flowers and seeds like we see here. And so to answer this question, we can turn to what we already know about flowering in other plants and other flowering plants. So this is an Arabidopsis plant. It's a weed. It probably grows in your backyard. But it is a plant that we use a lot as a model in lab studies in molecular biology. And this is because, to some degree, all plants are genetically similar. And so we can ask questions about plant development and plant reproduction and all these types of things and study them in Arabidopsis and use our findings to make conclusions about other flowering plants like eelgrass. So what do we know about flowering in Arabidopsis? We know that the plant can sense its environment through temperature, through sunlight, through water and nutrient availability. And the plant takes in all of that information and then through genetic mechanisms is able to cue some kind of growth response, whether that's just the plant physically getting bigger, or the plant flowering, or the plant producing seeds, some sort of response like this. And so, thinking about this question in eelgrass, if we're trying to understand the response of producing seeds, if we want to know how do we get that response, then one way we can go about studying this is by looking at the genetic mechanism that underlies that whole process. And so this is really the focus of my research at UW, is I'm trying to figure out, what genes are involved. So like we have the human genome, we also have the eelgrass genome, and I can look through the sequences of that genome and figure out potential genes that might be involved in flowering. I also want to understand how do those genes help sense the environment. And what I mean by that is I want to know what genes are being turned on and turned off in response to specific environmental conditions. And then lastly, with all that information, I want to know if we can predict how populations are going to respond to a changing climate. And when I say respond, I mean, will they be able to flower and produce seeds as the climate continues to change? And so I unfortunately don't have time to go into all the work that I've done over the past few years towards this goal, but I want to share a little bite-sized bit of some findings we had from this experiment we conducted this summer. So this summer we collected a bunch of flowering plants, as seen on the right, and then some vegetative plants as seen on the left. And we collected them all, and basically we're looking for differences in the level of certain genes. Are they being turned on or turned off in the different states? And so an example of some results that we would get looks a lot like this. You see we have vegetative. That's the data for vegetative on the left, flowering on the right. On the y-axis, the vertical axis, the higher the point, the more the gene is being turned on. And we see exactly this, that in flowering tissue, we have higher levels of this gene being turned on. So maybe this gene is involved in flowering. One other way we can go about testing that is by actually going back to our model, Arabidopsis, and plugging that gene into the Arabidopsis plant and see if it alters its development in any way. And in fact, it does. We see really tiny flowers appear on an Arabidopsis plant, which suggests to us that this gene probably is involved in flowering. So this is just one way that we're kind of going about answering this question. I'll show another set of data as well. This is another gene that we were looking at, and we see the inverse trend. We see higher levels of this gene being turned on in these non-flowering or vegetative plants. And when we put that gene into Arabidopsis, we see no flowering take place at all, which suggests to us this gene maybe is involved in stopping flowering from happening. So obviously we're still investigating all of this, but this is some of the current work that I've been up to. I just want to go ahead and wrap this talk up by sharing some resources if you're feeling super inspired today and want to know more about eelgrass restoration. I encourage you to check out, first, the Washington Department of Natural Resources Seagrass Restoration Story Map. This is an interactive website that has literally every piece of information about current seagrass restoration here in our state that you could ever dream of. Super informative. Also, if you're interested in seagrass globally, the UN put together this really great report called Out of the Blue, which talks about not only the biological importance of seagrass, but also like the economic importance of it, how it affects coastal communities worldwide, etc. Another really great, thorough report. And this was deemed so important by the UN that they actually deemed March 1st World Seagrass Day, and this was celebrated for the first time last week. So happy World Seagrass Day. And then lastly, if you're interested more in the research side of things, I encourage you to check out Project Seagrass. They're a UK-based organization that has a lot of public-facing seagrass conservation research going on. Another great resource. My final plug, if you are feeling wow, all I want to do is go onto a tide flat and look at our state's eelgrass, bask in that glory, I encourage you to volunteer for the Aquatic Assessment and Monitoring Team with the Department of Natural Resources. This is a group of volunteers that goes out a few times a year to take data on status of current eelgrass populations in Washington, and all of that data is used to inform future restoration efforts that take place in our state. So super important, a really fun way to get outside and see some of our state's natural beauty. And with that, go ahead and wrap up. Just to say that science is never done in isolation. None of this work would ever be able to be done if I wasn't supported by this massive team and network of support behind me. The Department of Natural Resources is largely responsible for funding my research. Thank you so much for all your time, and I hope you like seagrasses now, and I'd love to take your questions.
All right, we'll take one question.
The question was, paraphrase, there's a large concentration of seagrasses that grow in the tropics. With the loss of coral reefs, could seagrasses potentially be used to replace those coral reefs? And the short answer is no, because seagrasses, unfortunately, are negatively affected by the same things that are causing the destruction of coral reefs. They also serve different services, coral reefs don't sequester carbon or pull carbon out of the atmosphere in the same way that seagrasses do. So we do need both, and unfortunately, neither can survive in our current trend. So not a great high note, but nice idea.
Thank you so much, Christine, for that amazing talk. We'll give it up for Christine.
You are listening to Morning News and Public Affairs on KBFG LP Seattle or online at kbfgseattle.org.
We just learned about what Washington State is doing for ecologically for restoration, as eelgrass is a great way to sequester carbon for decarbonization. Now we're going to go on to Annalise's talk, which is about decarbonization using renewable energy. She is a second-year master's student at the School of Public Policy and Governance. She's having a concentration in environmental policy. She currently interns at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and she works on projects related to decarbonization, energy equity, tribal engagement, and marine renewable energy. So after graduating in June, she hopes to be an energy policy analyst in her free time. She loves to hike with friends. Give it up for Annalise.
As Andrea mentioned, my name is Annalise, and I will be talking about the path to decarbonization, Washington State's transition to 100% renewable energy. I just want to preface that I am not an expert by any means, but if there's any questions about current projects that I do or work that I do, happy to talk about it later. Looking at greenhouse gas emissions across the state, although these numbers are from 2019, they're still relatively the same. But right now, transportation is the largest greenhouse gas emitter with 39%. Residential, commercial, industrial heating is at 25%. So as we can see, transportation is the largest emitter, and residential, commercial, industrial heating is the second. I'm not necessarily going to get into too much in clean buildings, but I just wanted to highlight that the 2019 Clean Buildings Act created energy performance standards for the commercial buildings that are larger than 50,000 square feet. This is the 2022 policy rollout from the Governor Inslee's office. There's 4 main priorities, so decarbonizing building sector, successfully implementing the CCA, investing more in clean transportation, so it's kind of looking at EVs, and building the clean energy future here in Washington. Starting to look at some of the legislation, so we're going to go over a few, beginning with CETA, the Clean Energy Transition Act, implemented in 2019. there are 3 main goals. So we have 3 timelines that we're essentially trying to meet with CETA. By 2025, all electric utilities serving Washington state customers are required to eliminate coal-fired generation. By 2030, all electric utilities must be greenhouse gas neutral, and by 2045, all electric utilities are required to generate 100% of their power from renewable or zero carbon resources. And through CETA, investor-owned utilities, also known as IOUs, must develop and implement plans to ensure movement towards these set goals. I want to preface that CETA is mainly looking at utilities. According to this legislation, there's 5 total IOUs, so 3 electric IOUs, Avista, Pacific Core, and Puget Sound Energy, and the 2 natural gas utilities, Cascade Natural Gas Corporation and Northwest Natural Gas Company, must develop specific plans, and these are known as Integrated Resource Plans, IRPs, on their goals toward obtaining renewable energy resources that will be used for their customers. And these IRPs will identify long-term energy needs within each utility. And utilities are required to provide their customers with the lowest cost possible while making this transition to ensure equitable distribution throughout this process. Utility companies need to update their IRPs every 2 years to ensure that progress is being made. Next, we have the Climate Commitment Act, which was recently implemented in 2021. The CCA is Washington's Cap and Invest program, which is a market-based program that reduces carbon pollution by limiting greenhouse gases. This program works by setting an emissions limit, which we can see at the top as the emissions cap, and it lowers that cap over time to ensure Washington meets greenhouse gas reduction commitments set in state by law. This program works alongside other policies to help Washington achieve its commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 95% by 2050. And I'll get into that more on the next slide, but right now you can see this graphic. We have the emissions cap, and we have 2 separate companies, one of which has higher emissions and the other has lower. So their emission allowance money from the auctions is still going to go to climate investments, which will go to overburdened communities and vulnerable populations. Over time, the cap is going to lower, so less emissions will be created. 2021 Washington State Energy Strategy, there are the 3 main outcomes of the strategy. So we have to have a 45% reduction in emissions below 1990 emission levels by 2030, 70% reduction in emission levels by 2040, and 95% reduction by 2050. The state strategy really emphasizes overburdened populations, low-income communities, and indigenous communities in the state, placing a heavy emphasis on them. As one of the leading states in decarbonization efforts, Washington is obligated to set an example for the rest of the country to follow. So the state energy strategy really places this emphasis to address inequities across the state. HEAL Act, the Healthy Environment for All Act, which was also recently implemented in 2021, eliminates environmental and health disparities among communities of color and low-income households. So the HEAL Act, it applies to multiple state agencies. We have Department of Ecology, Health, Department of Resources, Commerce, Transportation, and Puget Sound Partnership. And these agencies work together as part of an Environmental Justice Council, an interagency work group that really brings together environmental justice advocates, practitioners, agency representatives as a way to co-develop environmental justice guidance, as well as to recommend ways to identify overburdened communities and create measures to track agency process on environmental justice goals. This is kind of showing how everything is going to work together to create equitable access. So I'm just going to go over 2 of these. So I'm going to go over reducing energy cost burdens and incorporating health disparity metrics. So for reducing energy cost burdens, a household faces a high energy burden when it spends more than 6% of its income on energy, and a severe energy burden is when a household spends more than 10% of its income on energy. Through some of the previous legislation that I had mentioned, such as CETA, there are more requirements for utilities to provide more types of assistance programs to their low-income customers, and their customers will also receive access to weatherization programs to ensure the proper insulation of their homes so that they can reduce their energy consumption. Second one, incorporating health disparity metrics. Through the HEAL Act, the Environmental Health Disparities Map from the Department of Health currently exists as a tool that can be used to map health disparities. So this map helps to show pollution measures such as diesel emissions and ozone, and also proximity to hazardous waste sites. And it displays measures such as poverty and cardiovascular disease, and it provides insights into where public investments can be prioritized as a way to help Washington communities so we can all benefit from clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment. And as we continue to transition to clean energy, there are going to be more considerations for overburdened communities. And I think personally, it will be really interesting to see how some of the data changes in the map as we continue to make this transition. Some of the clean energy that currently exists includes wind, solar, hydrogen, nuclear. Right now, wind and solar are highly used in Washington across the state, replacing coal and natural gas usage. Washington is one of the leading states in wind energy production. So right now we have 2,000 wind turbines installed across the state. Energy efficiency, so this is mainly looking at utilities and what they can provide to their customers. As I said, under CETA, they're required to offer more programs for their low-income customers, and they provide more incentives to upgrade to energy efficiency appliances to help make this transition. Many homes have gas stoves. This can create not only indoor air pollution, but can also contribute to need for us to convert to electric as we continue as a state to make this transition to clean energy. Lastly, just wanted to mention hydro. Snake River dams are used a lot in Washington as a way for us to have clean energy. I'm not going to get too much into it, but happy to answer questions afterwards. Lastly, since transportation is currently the highest emitter, just wanted to highlight it. There's currently a growing market, especially for used EVs, EVs being electric vehicles. And in Washington right now, the Clean Fuel Standard works besides the CCA, the Climate Commitment Act, to target the largest source of emissions in Washington. So the Clean Fuel Standard law essentially requires fuel suppliers to reduce carbon intensity in transportation fuels to 20% below 2017 levels by 2030. In addition to this, use and adoption of EVs is very encouraged, especially through federal. Furthermore, in Washington, all new passenger vehicles that will be sold will be electric by 2030. Huge influx in charging stations across the state as we transition to EVs, and General Motors, among others, will only sell zero-emission vehicles by 2035, following in suit with Washington State. Recommendations. Moving forward for Washington State, we have increased public transportation. So right now, the light rail only exists in Seattle, going from the north part of the state to the south part of the state, so really only going from Northgate to Engle Lake. And it does not exist on an east to west scale. And all across the rest of the state, there is also, especially in rural areas, a lack of public transportation. So if this is increased, it could encourage a lot more people to use public transportation, such as buses or trains. We can also provide subsidies for EVs. California has currently done this, proven to be pretty effective, right? There's only federal incentives, so the IRA, the Investment Reduction Act, currently provides tax credits for EV purchases, but this does not help low-income communities because you can only get the tax credit after purchasing the EV. So for those who don't have the income or the money to purchase an EV out of pocket and then receive the tax credit, it's not very helpful. Lastly, increased offshore wind, solar, and marine renewable energy. These are starting to become more prevalent across the state, so keeping up with the increase of them. Lastly, a call to action. What can you do to support Washington's transition to clean energy? So starting off with energy efficiency appliances, there's lots of incentives through utilities as well as through some of the state laws. Looking at next with electric vehicles, as I had mentioned, there are lots of incentives currently on the table to currently make that transition, as Washington State is one of the leaders in making this transition. Lastly, be informed and advocate for policies that support and promote clean energy, whether that be reaching out to your local legislator and advocating for these kinds of policies. There are also lots of agencies currently working on this information, so there's many ways to get involved and be a part of this transition. And with that, I hope you all have learned a lot, and thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Annalise. And we would like to take one question from the audience. So I'll hand go up here. Yeah.
The question was, is there a plan for the state to replace the incoming gas tax as we transition to electric vehicles? I currently do not know that. I will say that I am not the most knowledgeable in the transportation sector, but I'm sure there might be someone else who can answer.
There's a road usage charge bill that was working through the legislature. I don't know what the current state of it is, but the idea was you drive so many miles, you pay so much for the road you drove on. Check it out, leg.wa.gov, and just look for road usage charge.
Awesome. Let's give it up for Annalise. Thank you.
You are listening to Morning News and Public Affairs on KBFG LP Seattle or online at kbfgseattle.org. We are listening to a Science on Tap program. entitled In Hot Pursuit of Climate Solutions, with graduate students from the University of Washington and Cascadia Climate Action. This event took place March 8, 2023, and included graduate students Sam Shugart, Annalise Stein, and Christina Nolan. The moderator is Andrea Richter-Sanchez.
We just had two great speakers talk about different decarbonization talks in Washington State. Moving here from Florida, it's pretty refreshing to be in a state that has such great progressive laws and policies. It's always great to see what's going to be on the horizon because we can always do better. For our next speaker, we're going to focus more on the business perspective because I feel like that's something we often gets lost in the conversation, but it's an incredibly important part. So I would like to welcome our next speaker, Sam, who is from the Foster School of Business. He is a Vashon Island native who studied international relations at Lewis and Clark College. Then he went to work in Myanmar for 5 years on several infrastructure projects, and he co-founded an agribusiness social enterprise. Since he returned to the U.S., he started his master's in business analytics at the Foster School of Business, currently doing an independent research project on climate risk disclosures and a project with a climate risk startup that he is part of. He's really fascinated by the process of turning the energy of the climate movement into ways to create systems change. Sam.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everyone who helped organize this. My name is Sam Shugart. I'm going to cover a few complex topics a little bit fast. If you're interested in any of these topics, email me for the slides. I'll have my email at the end, and I have links to most of the topics at the foot of the slides. So I'm going to be talking tonight about climate scenario modeling and securities fraud. And to give an overview, I'm going to touch on introduction to climate modeling, climate risk, how different activism and different lawsuits can affect disclosures, and my current work. Just to kind of summarize, I'm at the UW, very interested in climate risk, trying to figure my life out as I graduate in June. And really the problem here I'm here to talk to you about is greenhouse gas emissions. How we make it go down. We know companies cause a lot of them. We don't want to burn the world down, but how do we get companies to change? My main focus is going to be on what I call the corporate bins of action. So bin 1 is where a company says, there's something that we should do. Bin 2 is where they say we are doing something. And bin 3 is where the leadership will actually finally take action and push for weekly updates until that thing gets done. We want to move these issues from bin 1 and bin 2 to bin 3. The question is, how do we do that? So next I'm going to talk a little bit about scenario modeling. This is from the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a UN group that works to collect climate analysis from a ton of different researchers, scientists, and other groups, trying to understand what the world will look like in 20, 30, and 50 years, and then what the effect of emissions and other human impacts will be on global temperature increases. And the goal of a lot of their reporting is to try to develop a shared understanding of where we're going across our entire planet and the actions we need to take to move down from the higher temperature scenarios to a lower temperature scenario that avoids a lot of the negative impacts we've seen discussed tonight. The question then is, what role do businesses play? And you see a lot about business making climate pledges. We have the Climate Pledge Arena in Seattle. You see net zero. And there's a big question of what does this all mean? So far, a lot could argue it doesn't mean much. A lot of my research looks at how businesses look at this from a risk standpoint, specifically through physical risk, which is what you imagine, hurricanes, fires, everything else, and then transition risk, which is what is the risk to the company of the transition to a net zero economy, to decarbonization. And if we go into a bit of detail on the next slide, this is from actually the Federal Reserve, which is working now with banks in the US to do a pilot on this. And then it's trying to get them to look at how you understand financial risk as climate risk in our system. So as I said, you have both the physical risks, acute and chronic, but then you have this area called transition risks. If you think about this as like Tesla versus Ford or GM, why was Tesla successful? They were able to move through a combination of subsidies, technology change, consumer demand. All these factors work together And all of these factors we're going to have to push more if we're going to decarbonize the economy. Getting businesses to think about this and thinking about how you move ahead of this is a core way we can help drive this change. And this is happening right now across different areas, where businesses are increasingly thinking about how do you look at the IPCC modeling and look at these scenarios and understand how this affects me. This is from a group called the Network for Green Financial Systems that is working with the IPCC models to try to translate it into terms that businesses and financial groups can understand and get them to take action to push us down from the 3-degree scenarios to the 1.5 degree and 1.4 degree scenarios. Businesses are seeing this move from an academic problem to a financial risk. 5 or 10 years ago, it was something that was seen as ESG or something that was seen as you might put out some nice statements. Now, as we saw in that earlier slide, the Federal Reserve of the US is requiring banks to start to look at these risks. And my main focus is going to be on the SEC, which I'll define in a second, and how it's pushing out legislation that would force publicly traded companies to disclose how they deal with these climate issues. But before we get to that, I'm going to walk through a few terms. The SEC stands for the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's the group that regulates all publicly traded companies in the US. If you are publicly traded, it means you're on the stock exchange. Most investors can go and buy and sell your stock, and you have to produce audited financial reports. So it means an external group has to audit your reports and then say this is an accurate representation of your company's operations. We do all this because fraud is bad, and companies do fraud a lot. So we try to figure out ways to make them not do fraud. The central goal is to try to figure out how this affects and how this relates to climate. And to help understand that, we are going to talk about one of my favorite people, Matt Levine. He writes for Bloomberg. He has a theory called everything everywhere is securities fraud. What is securities fraud? Imagine you're a company that sells cars. Someone calls you up from your engineering team and says, 1 out of every 1,000 cars explodes and kills everyone. You go on an investor call, you say, everything is fine, our cars are great, buy our stock. Investors buy the stock. It gets out that your cars explode and kill people. The stock crashes. Investors lose their money. Investors can then sue the company and say, you told me everything was fine. You knew your cars explode and kill people. I lost money because the stock went down. It's a weird thing in our financial system, but it's one of the core parts that companies care about because no one wants to be sued by their shareholders. Now, what does this have to do with climate? Our next slide is going to introduce us to our friends at Exxon, and a great paper I recommend everyone to read that looks on ExxonMobil's internal climate projections from the 1980s. This graph should look a little familiar. It looks a little bit like the IPCC modeling that we have today. They had internal climate scientists looking at the impact of CO2 emissions on temperature changes going back 20, 30, 40 years. They knew about this and did not disclose this to investors. And because of that, it gets us to a very interesting place where there's a growing recognition that even the shareholders themselves don't end up well if we burn the whole planet. How do we take action about this? Well, we need to think about, background. We need to think about how shareholders are affected. And this leads us to an interesting duality. So on one side, if you're a shareholder and you just want money, it seems like Exxon should pump all the oil. Oil is great for business. It makes great profit. So the last thing that you would want Exxon to do is to stop pumping oil and to be sued because you lose money. But because of the way security fraud legal action can work, groups, especially activist shareholders, and a group brought a suit against Exxon, arguing that Exxon failed to disclose its transition risk, that risk of future government regulations. They knew that climate change was going to be a thing. They knew there were going to be large societal impacts. They didn't disclose this, and they invested in heavy GHG emitting assets. And so because of that, the risk from climate change regulation is greater than represented. Now, will this lawsuit succeed? Very questionable, but it puts them in a really interesting place of having to defend their strategy and explain how they're trying to deal with this transition and transition risks. And we've seen other groups start to talk about this. So the goal then is, how do you engage with this? You have to try to look at companies' disclosures. And it gets us to this really weird concept I find fascinating called materiality, which is how we try to determine what risks companies disclose. And when you dig into the actual definition of what materiality is, the Supreme Court defines it as a substantial likelihood that the fact would be viewed by a reasonable investor as having significantly altered the total mix of information available. What does that mean? I argue it kind of means nothing. It's all up to the courts. This is rapidly changing over the expectations of what information that companies provide their shareholders. And we've seen action from different groups requiring companies to disclose more and taking lawsuits. I want to pause on this slide before I end over this fascinating concept that is called double materiality, that's big in the EU, where the idea is that companies should be held accountable to the material impacts on both their investors, like we normally define, as well as on the broader world. So different activist groups, CSOs, and the broader community should be able to have the same information about the company's GHG emissions and impacts on the climate. This is emerging in Europe. It's still a long ways off in the US, but we are seeing some progress. So what we see now, and TCFD stands for Task Force on Climate Disclosure Reporting, groups have started to go over how they view the world, what scenarios they're modeling, how they think the world will change in the future, and what actions they're taking. For example, Microsoft has one of the more complete reports, and they list, sorry, this is very small font, but measurable action they're taking to try to hit their net zero and transition targets, which is still a very nebulous concept. Everyone likes to say they're net zero. How do you get there? It's a big question. There's a lot of complexity and caveats to this, where ideally we could go after companies that say they're net zero, get them to actually disclose how they're doing that, and hold them accountable. But there's a lot of regulation and politics that gets in the way. However, there are groups working on this. So part of my research is looking at regulation across the board, where there's countries taking a lot stronger action, especially in the EU. New Zealand just went really hard. Their regulation just started January of this year, as well as other places that are pushing this regulation into place. And then understanding, using a mixture of supervised learning, ML, and other areas, how to pull apart these 400- and 500-page company reports and try to get at what they're actually disclosing and flag things for investors, different stakeholders, or someone who's just curious to say, all these companies say they're net zero. What does that actually mean? How do they articulate that in their reports? And I'm trying to figure out how to make this as a career too, where the space is rapidly changing. Still a work in progress. But there are some groups that are doing cool stuff. Shout out to People for Climate Action. I just found out, and you have a great website and great push at how you try to push groups locally, as well as broadly. There's a group called OS Climate. That's a group of technically minded people coming together to design software solutions for trying to aggregate data and make this data publicly accessible. So kind of in conclusion, climate modeling allows us to try to develop a shared understanding of what the world and future looks like. When companies say they're net zero or someone says they're net zero, someone has tried to figure out how that's accomplished somewhere. New regulations and legislation is going to require companies to disclose how they actually do that. The new SEC law will say, if you say you're net zero, you have to disclose the strategy you're going to use to reach that. And then, ideally, different investors, NGOs, groups, we saw the activist hedge funds, which is a really weird thing to say, can use this information to try to take action and push towards a better world and push greenhouse gas emissions down and push this broader transition to happening. So if you have any questions, interest, want to see a broader overview of some of these subjects, here's my email and a great kind of solar punk picture to end on. But thank you, everyone. Hopefully that helped, and I look forward to everyone's questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam, so much for that amazing presentation. I'll take a question for Sam if anybody has a question they want to ask him.
The question was, what do I think of moving from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism and kind of broadening the definition? I really support that on a personal level. I think if you can actually hop back to the double materiality slide, in Europe and a few groups, especially Northern Europe, have really pushed forward this idea of this concept of double materiality, where you expand what you hold companies accountable for. Instead of just investors, saying that we need to broaden who gets this information and then how we understand companies' impacts on broader stakeholders and on the broader world. I am hesitant, though, in the US, just because we have such weird politics in the US around what ESG, or it gets so politicized, that I see a lot of this getting killed before it takes into greater action. My hope is that law passed in Europe and other places will force companies to actually take action on this, regardless of US law. A bit like the situation with privacy and the action that the EU took on privacy law forces US companies to adapt.
You are listening to Morning News and Public Affairs on KBFG LP Seattle or online at kbfgseattle.org.
I'm going to have our panelists come up, our 3 speakers, and then we're going to take just general questions from the flashcards and from the crowd as well. So one of our first questions, I would assume, is for Annalise. As a renter, is there a way to incentivize our landlords to make the switch to energy-efficient appliances?
That is a very good question. There's beginning to be more considerations for renters. As of right now in the legislation, everything is currently for homeowners. I cannot give you an estimated timeline of when things are going to start being considered for renters, but I know that there are a lot of talk in various state departments and various agencies about having more incentives for renters since it has to be done through your landlord. If anything, I'd say that you can show your landlord some of the energy efficiency incentives and hope that they decide to install those in your current apartment. But as of right now, there is a huge lack for renters, unfortunately, and that is something that has been highlighted in various literature and as well as through a lot of programs. Thank you for the question.
An amazing seagrass question. So in the PNW, is there a natural predator of seagrass, kind of like in Florida, like the manatee? And then also, are these large predators returning to the restored seagrass and eelgrass areas?
That's a good question. So I'll be honest, off the top of my head, I don't think I know of any predators that specifically eat eelgrass. A lot of algae and other things will grow on eelgrass, and those things are eaten by different organisms. I also have just seen in the field birds will eat seagrass and peck it down to its little nubs. In terms of its return to restored sites, I actually don't know that. I don't have any data off the top of my head. I would assume so, but because I think there is evidence the general ecosystem dynamics do return. So yeah, my guess would be yes, but I don't know off the top of my head. But great question and good thing to consider.
And some follow-up questions on that. So what is the worst threat to seagrass in Washington?
Ooh, the worst one in Washington. I feel like there's a lot of unfortunately, compounding effects that come into play. So, one of the things, and I wouldn't by any means see this as the worst one, but the heat waves that we are experiencing this past summer, that are in 2021, that major heat wave, that actually coincided with low tides. So, low tide was in the middle of the day when that happened. Not only seagrasses and eelgrass, but kelp and lots of other marine intertidal organisms really suffered at the hands of those heat waves. And so as heat waves continue to increase, we will probably see definitely significant drop-offs in our eelgrass populations. Also just in general, like I said, especially immediate human disturbance events like dredging and construction, which happen a lot, especially in the wake of increased logging causes more erosion into the rivers, which then brings more sediment into the bays and estuaries, which increases the frequency which we need to dredge those bays and estuaries out. And so with those factors also increasing, we could expect our eelgrass populations to suffer here. For more information on that specific question, definitely that story map that I referenced actually has a map of I think all the documented sites where eelgrass grows in Washington, and the ones where they're monitoring, they show trends of like increase or decrease. So there's definitely a lot of information available for that, for those types of questions out there.
Question for Sam. What is the difference between avoiding securities fraud and insider trading? If you have information about something about a company that devalues its stock evaluation and you share it with investors to protect them from loss, is that not insider trading?
The key difference is insider trading is when you trade on something before it's public knowledge versus disclosing something that will devalue the company's stock. The goal is to disclose it in a way that everyone gets that information at the same time. So if I learn that our company just crashed an oil, or another example, if I learn there's a pipeline leak that's not public yet, and I'm an executive in the company, and I call a bunch of my friends and say, hey, we got a massive pipeline leak, it's gonna crash our stock, quick, sell all your stock, that's insider trading. Versus if the company announces it to all their investors at the same time, the stock will crash, but everyone gets the information at the same time. And then a lot of this big push to understand risk and put it in the financial reports is to give investors and anyone who reads the financial reports an idea of what the risks are before they invest or before the company takes action.
This is a question that I think the three of you could answer in different ways. I am worried that the increase in population in the world is too rarely discussed. Can you address that?
It's a challenge with both how you deal with population increases and resource distribution. I would like to focus on it much more as kind of a resource distribution question, where across the board, if you help people move towards higher incomes and towards more stable lives, birth rates tend to move down to either replacement or somewhere similar. So to me, it's less of a worry of we're having too many people and more of a worry of how we're distributing resources in our system, which is profoundly unequal, and how we can try to shift incentives for both companies and governments, but especially companies because they control a lot of the resources, to trying to get more equitable distribution to hopefully then help balance out both how people use resources and balance out longer-term population trends.
Maybe one more question for the three of you guys as well. What gives you hope for the future despite ongoing climate change? I personally really like this question because a lot of us in here, we study climate-related topics, and friends of mine who aren't in this thing, they ask me, how can you do that? It's kind of depressing. Well, there are solutions. That's why we have these speakers talk about possible solutions, and there is hope. So I really appreciate this question and would love to hear your guys' perspective, whoever wants to answer it, yeah.
So one thing that I think comes to mind for me is in the wake of increased technology across like different countries and like social media and the internet, there's been a lot more opportunity, in my opinion, for crosstalk amongst like subfield communities. Like, I mean, for tonight, for example, I'm in the biology department and I very rarely get to interact with people who study policy or who study business, and tonight all three of us are here together. My project, for example, is something that, I draw on a lot of different resources that I think, previously weren't able to be as well connected. And so having this increase in like ease of communication and sharing data and sharing information, I think is really going to revolutionize the way we study climate and climate change in the future. And yeah, I feel like that gives me a lot of hope. I'll offer this up to you guys.
I'll also jump in here really quick. I have been very fortunate to meet and work with many people who are equally as passionate about finding solutions to climate change like I have been. So it's really inspiring to be able to meet people and know that despite all of the challenges, that we are all on the same page and all trying to get to a world that's more, clean, healthy, happy, just overall great. I'd also like to say that during the transition to clean energy, there is a huge emphasis on stopping using fossil fuels and non-renewable resources. So this transition to renewable resources has been really incredible to see how many people genuinely want to make this change, not only for the world, but for the health and benefit of everybody else. So that's also been very inspiring.
I think for me, technology change in terms of tools that can both help us transition the economy and kind of scale up new energy and power and sources, as well as tools to hold companies accountable. There's some really cool stuff happening around greenhouse gas accounting and around using satellites to look at methane blooms and methane leaks, where even if a company says one thing, you can pull up the satellite data and say, here's a list of your facilities, here's the methane emissions, this is wrong. So seeing these new tools emerge and having this momentum towards trying to understand how you translate all this data information into making sure people take action to decarbonize and transition gives me a lot of hope that we can start to move the needle on some of these big problems. Thank you.
All right, so I have some eelgrass questions. So once you determine the gene that causes growth in eelgrass, will you be making an effort to stimulate and artificially have more growth? Is this growth gene unique to only eelgrass or all seagrass?
Gotcha, great question. So to answer it in parts, so the first question was focused on can we artificially stimulate growth? I think for the sake of preserving the natural populations in Washington, we would not do that on a large scale, but what we can do is bring them into controlled lab facilities and test which, if we grow a seagrass plant or an eelgrass plant at a certain environmental condition, certain temperature, certain water pH, do we see differences in the way the plants grow and develop? And so that is actually something that is actively ongoing that we are doing as part of this work. The real idea is that when we restore an eelgrass population, right, we take seeds or even whole shoots from one site and we actually will move them to another. And when we do that, the site that they're originally from, those plants are adapted for the environmental conditions of that specific site. But when we move them to another one, they may not be as well suited. Maybe the water there is a little warmer, maybe it's a little bit higher up on the tidal elevation, so they experience a lot more air at low tide. There's all sorts of things that can change. And so by understanding which populations are more prone to produce seeds and reproduce under certain conditions, we can then strategically pick, we want to take from this site when we're going to restore this area over here that's missing eelgrass. So that's kind of one of the applications in mind. And then to get at the next question of, is that growth gene specific to eelgrass? The answer is roughly actually no. So in all flowering plants, that FT, so there was a bunch of letters, but then FT and then a number. FT actually stands for flowering locus something. It's the name of a gene that is present for the most part in all flowering plants, and in all flowering plants is to some extent involved in flowering processes. So I didn't really go over it, but the way I identified which genes may or may not be involved in flowering was looking for that gene specifically. And so it is conserved. In conserved, I mean present in kind of similar ways across all flowering plants. And that makes using model systems like Arabidopsis a really powerful tool in studying other plant biology and other systems that we can't necessarily grow in the lab as easily.
Great, thank you. So this will be our last round of questions. Last question for Sam. Pros and cons of a positive action strategy towards responsible investing and why?
Ooh, that is a lot to unpack for the last question. Responsible investing can mean a ton of different things. If you are talking to someone in the financial community, one thing to ask about is if they're doing positive or negative screening. Sometimes you just say, to us, responsible investing means we won't invest in anyone that does bad things. And that can mean a ton of different things. I'm less a fan of that. To other people, responsible investing can mean I want to actively seek out companies or groups that are making targeted investments or making their whole business around helping further the change towards a better, more equitable world. And that can not just mean things for climate, that can mean broader things around how they deal with social issues, how they deal with governance issues. I think some of the cons are a lot of these things don't have definitions. So for a while, companies can say a lot of different things, and it's really difficult for investors or other activists or really anyone to pick apart what these things mean. But as these regulations roll forward, companies will have to disclose more of what they say. So to kind of summarize, I would recommend people kind of drill down to figure out when someone says responsible investing, what criteria they're actually using. I think there can be huge pros around driving investment and money and towards companies that are making more positive impacts. But I think there can be cons where groups will sometimes misrepresent their impacts, or they'll be calculating certain metrics or things on the back end that's hard to understand and kind of muddies the water. But I hope as regulation increases and there's more awareness, we see a good transition towards this driving positive action.
So the transport sector is a big contributor. How do we make our cities more walkable and bikeable like small EU cities? How would that look like in America?
That is a great question. Europe essentially right now has a different structure than America. So if we would make the US, or like Washington, for example, scaling that down a little bit, easier for walking and biking, there are going to be a lot of changes that are needed. So this includes looking at more of the landscape. So even right now, if you look at sidewalks, not all of the sidewalks are paved properly. There's a lot of updates that need to be made to them. I know for a fact that across Washington State, it's very difficult for those who are disabled to use sidewalks and other areas just because of the updates that need to be made. Haven't been yet. So starting off with sidewalks, increasing bike lanes, as Seattle has currently been doing across the state, would be a great way to continue to do that. I think just because the US there's so many rural communities that driving and having a car is so prevalent right now that making that transition to having it be more walkable, more bikeable, will take quite a while, but it is possible. There just needs to be a lot of funding that goes toward it. I'm sure, as everyone knows, funding is not always the easiest thing to get. So definitely advocate for that and really push for it more, because it is possible, and it will definitely take quite a while for us to get there, unfortunately. Great question. Thank you.
All right, that's wrapping up our panel. First, I want to thank everybody who made it out here tonight. I want to thank our subcommittee in the program on climate change, public engagement, all these amazing people here who helped put on this event. I really appreciate you guys, everyone who came. I also really want to thank Mary from TCA, because she also was a big part of helping us plan this event. So thank you, Mary. Appreciate it. We will have another event next quarter. The date is not known yet, but most likely late May. Again, thank you so much for coming. This is my last quarter. I'm graduating in like a week. So thank you. I'm very passionate about science communication, and I love putting on these events. So thank you again for coming. Most of all, thank you so much for our speakers. So a big round of applause for them. We definitely learn something new every day. You guys gave me a lot of hope. So there's hope and there's beer. So everyone, have a nice night and go on and mingle. Thank you.
We are listening to a Science on Tap program entitled In Hot Pursuit of Climate Solutions, with graduate students from the University of Washington and Cascadia Climate Action. This event took place March 8th, 2023, and included graduate students Sam Shugart, Annalise Stein, and Christina Nolan. The moderator is Andrea Rector-Sanchez. And Cascadia Climate Action has a fabulous website that posts events happening all around Seattle.